When a medical examiner performs an autopsy, they're usually just looking for a strictly biological cause of death.
Right, yeah, like you find the trauma, log the damage, and the story is over.
Exactly. But sometimes human anatomy tells this completely different, it's an almost terrifying story about the psychological toll of a person's life.
Yeah, the physical reality of relentless, just unyielding stress is something we rarely conceptualize
Yeah.
until it's laid bare in a medical report.
And there's this startling, really visceral medical fact hidden in our sources today. So on April 4th, 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was only 39 years old.
Just 39.
But the autopsy revealed something absolutely shocking. The medical examiners found that he had the heart of a 60-year-old.
It's a detail that just completely stops you in your tracks. Biographers and medical professionals, they all point to that severe premature aging as the direct biological result of the unimaginable pressure he carried, like every single day.
Right. And it makes you ask yourself, what kind of relentless, crushing pressure ages a human heart 20 years beyond its actual time on Earth?
Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, our mission is to take a stack of historical sources and use them to chisel away the polished marble of the icon. We want to reveal the complex, radical, deeply human, and heavily burdened man underneath the legend.
It's such an important mission because we tend to forget the human being.
Okay, let's unpack this. We usually only encounter historical figures as statues in a park, or as safe, inspirational quotes printed on a calendar. But today, we're going to look at the unpolished stone. We're going to explore the severe doubts, the teenage rebellion, the near-death experiences, and the intense, suffocating state surveillance that really defined his day-to-day existence.
Yeah, to truly understand the person who would eventually bear the weight of a massive social movement, we really have to start at the very beginning. And the historical record throws a curveball immediately because the boy we're talking about wasn't even named Martin. Yeah, I was looking at the source materials about his early life, and I literally had to do a double take. He was born in Atlanta in 1929. But his birth certificate says Michael King Jr.
Right.
So what is the story behind the name we all actually know today?
So his father, Michael King Sr., was a really prominent Baptist minister. And in 1934, when young Michael was just 5 years old, the church sent his father on a multinational trip. The itinerary included a stop in Berlin for the Congress of the Baptist World Alliance.
Wait, 1934 in Berlin?
Yeah.
That is right. As Nazism is rapidly rising to power in Germany, that must have been a terrifying environment for an African-American minister to just walk into?
Oh, it was an incredibly tense period. In fact, the oppressive atmosphere of rising fascism prompted the Baptist Congress in Berlin to formally pass a resolution condemning racial animosity and oppression.
Wow.
Yeah, the stark reality of what was happening in Germany, combined with the profound history of the reformer Martin Luther, the one who stood up to the massive power of the Catholic Church, it deeply moved Michael Sr.
So he just decided to change it right then and there.
Well, when he returned home to Atlanta, he made this monumental decision. He formally changed both of their names. He became Martin Luther King Sr., and his 5-year-old son became Martin Luther King Jr.
It's almost like the father was rewriting their family's destiny, right?
Yeah.
Like based on this profound encounter with history. But taking on that name didn't magically shield young Martin from a deeply troubled childhood.
Not at all.
Because the sources describe some intensely dark moments. We're talking about severe childhood trauma here.
The documents reveal a child who struggled with an overwhelming, almost crushing sense of moral guilt. There's a really well-documented incident from when he was young. He was playing at home, and his brother slid down a banister and accidentally collided with their grandmother. Yeah, she was knocked completely unresponsive. And Martin genuinely believed she was dead. He blamed himself for the accident, and in his despair, he actually attempted suicide by jumping out of a second-story window.
That is incredibly heavy for a child. Jumping out of a window because the guilt is just too much to process.
He survived, thankfully, because his grandmother was still alive and he wasn't critically injured by the fall. But the tragedy compounded a few years later. When Martin was 12, he snuck away from his studies to go watch a local parade.
Okay.
And while he was out, his grandmother suffered a massive heart attack and died.
Let me guess, his mind went straight back to the guilt. He thought he was being punished for deceiving his parents to go to the parade.
He was completely devastated. The idea that his minor transgression had somehow caused her death just consumed him. He jumped out of that second-story window a second time.
Oh my gosh. Twice.
Twice. His father had to spend significant time counseling him, strictly instructing him that he shouldn't blame himself, trying to frame the loss as part of God's larger plan. But Martin deeply struggled to accept that theological comfort.
And on top of that profound internal struggle, he's also colliding with the external reality of the Jim Crow South. The sources detail this specific incident at age 6.
Right, the friend across the street.
Yeah. He had a white friend whose father owned a business across the street from the King home. They played together constantly. But when it came time to start attending separate, segregated schools, the white parents abruptly forbade their son from playing with Martin. They explicitly told the boy, "We are white and you are colored."
And when King went to his parents to try and understand why his friend was suddenly taken away, they had to sit down and explain the brutal, systemic history of slavery and racism in America.
Which is a devastating conversation for any parent to have with a child.
Absolutely. King later reflected on this moment and admitted that the conversation made him, and this is a direct quote, determined to hate every white person.
I really need to stop and highlight this. We think of MLK as the ultimate paragon of Christian love and nonviolence, right?
Right, the statue version of him is practically glowing with universal brotherhood.
Exactly. But the actual human being started out as a heartbroken 6-year-old declaring he wanted to hate all white people. How does that kid eventually become the global icon of peace?
This is perhaps the most crucial takeaway from his early years. His philosophy of nonviolent love wasn't some innate magical personality trait he was simply born with.
Right.
It was an intellectual and spiritual framework he had to rigorously, painfully build. His parents instructed him that it was his Christian duty to love everyone, but the sources show he had to actively, constantly work to overcome his own entirely justified anger. It was a daily choice, not a default setting.
And that anger was paired with some intense skepticism as he grew older. The sources paint a picture of a teenager who wasn't just sitting quietly in the church pews nodding along. He was a sharp-dressing, super vibrant kid.
Oh yeah, his friends actually nicknamed him Tweed or Tweety because he had this huge affinity for tailored tweed suits and shiny patent leather shoes.
I love that detail. And he was known for flirting, and he was apparently the absolute best jitterbug dancer in his social circle.
He was fully immersed in the culture of a normal teenager. But intellectually, he was fiercely rebellious against the strictures of his father's world. At age 13, he completely shocked his Sunday school class by openly denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus.
To put that in context for you listening, if you grow up in a traditional conservative Baptist household, especially as the pastor's son, the literal physical resurrection of Jesus coming back from the dead isn't just a metaphor.
No, not at all.
It is the absolute bedrock of the entire theology. Rejecting that at 13 means you are questioning the foundational literalism of your entire community.
And he experienced what he described in his own writings as unrelenting doubts about religion. He rejected biblical literalism entirely. He even questioned whether he would ever find any personal satisfaction in the church because he simply couldn't identify with the highly emotional displays of faith at his father's congregation. He viewed himself as a rationalist.
So how does a skeptical, jitterbugging teenager who doubts the Bible become one of the most famous reverends in history? The sources suggest it didn't happen in the South. It took a trip up north to shatter his expectations of what American society could actually look like.
Yeah, at just 15 years old, King was admitted to Morehouse College. But during the summer before his freshman year, he and several other students traveled up to Simsbury, Connecticut.
Right.
The goal was to earn money by working on a tobacco farm.
And let's be clear, this wasn't a summer camp. They were doing grueling, back-breaking agricultural labor, picking tobacco in 100-degree heat for about $4 a day. But the significance of the trip had nothing to do with the farming. It was his first time experiencing the integrated North.
The sheer contrast fundamentally altered his worldview. He wrote a letter to his father describing the train ride. He said the moment they passed Washington, D.C., the physical barriers of segregation just vanished. On weekends, the students would leave the farm and go into Hartford, Connecticut. They ate in fine dining restaurants without being asked to go to the back door. They went to movie theaters and sat wherever they pleased.
I read the actual quote from his letter home, and he sounded utterly amazed. He wrote, "Negroes and whites go to the same church." He finally saw, with his own eyes, what integration looked like in practice. Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like that tobacco farm in Connecticut was the greenhouse for the Southern Civil Rights Movement.
That's a great way to put it.
He saw the possibilities, and it clearly lit a fire in him, because fast forward a few years to 1950, he is a seminary student in Pennsylvania, and he visits a tavern called Mary's Cafe in Maple Shade, New Jersey.
What's fascinating here is the context of this visit. It's critical. King and his friends didn't just stumble into Mary's cafe. They went there fully knowing the establishment had a notorious reputation for refusing black patrons.
So it was an intentional test of the system.
Exactly. They sat down, and the white owner, a man named Ernest Nichols, flatly refused to serve them. He wouldn't even pour them a glass of ginger ale.
But King and his friends don't just leave, right? They refuse to back down, explicitly citing New Jersey's state anti-discrimination law. They are demanding their legal rights. So the owner escalates things dramatically.
No, he's dramatic.
He stomps outside, grabs a literal gun, comes back, and fires it into the air, shouting at them, "I'd kill for less!"
In 1950, a black man facing a white business owner with a gun would have every historical reason to run away and simply count himself lucky to be alive.
Right.
They did flee the cafe, fearing for their lives. But King didn't let the issue drop there. He went straight to the local police department. When the local cops refused to assist him, he contacted the NAACP. He forced the issue through the legal system and successfully filed an official police report against the armed owner.
The owner was actually criminally charged and forced to pay a fine. It's an incredible story. And you can see the blueprint here. He isn't just angry, he's weaponizing the law. He is provoking an unjust system to force a public reckoning. It's a perfect preview of the tactics that would define his later career.
You can trace a direct line from Mary's Cafe to his later strategy of nonviolent direct action. He learned that raw emotional outrage wasn't enough. You needed a tactical framework to expose the brutality of segregation to the broader public.
Okay, so he figures out the strategy. He heads back south to Montgomery as a pastor, ready to lead the revolution, right?
Actually, no. The historical record contradicts that completely. When history formally called him to lead, he was deeply reluctant.
Really?
Yeah. Let's move to 1955 and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, the seasoned local civil rights leaders, including a prominent organizer named E.D. Nixon, planned a massive citywide boycott of the transit system. They needed a figurehead, and they drafted King.
But I found this fascinating. They didn't pick him because he was a towering, legendary orator yet. They selected him primarily because he was the new guy in town.
Exactly.
He was the brand new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Because he was new, he hadn't had time to form political alliances or make deeply entrenched local enemies. He was a blank slate, which made it easier for him to act as the public face.
And King hesitated. He told the organizers he would only accept the leadership role if literally no one else wanted the job. He was not actively seeking the spotlight.
And the moment he steps into that spotlight, the personal toll is horrific. During the 385 days of the Montgomery boycott, his family home is bombed. He is repeatedly thrown in jail. And a few years later, in 1958, he is at a book signing in Harlem when a mentally ill woman named Isola Curry approaches him and plunges a steel letter opener directly into his chest.
Just nearly piercing his aorta.
He barely survives. So he is surviving bombings and literal stabbings long before the peak of the movement. It really makes you wonder, was he driving this historical movement, or was the movement just sweeping him up into its dangerous vortex?
That tension defined his early leadership. After Montgomery, there were campaigns like the Albany movement in Georgia, where King was largely reacting to events, and the results were mixed or unsuccessful.
Okay.
He quickly realized he couldn't just let the chaotic forces of the movement sweep him along. He had to dictate the terms of engagement. He had to be strategic about where and how to confront segregation.
Which brings us to Birmingham in 1963.
Birmingham was a masterclass in controlled, strategic provocation. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, went into Birmingham with a deliberate plan. They used nonviolent but highly confrontational tactics.
They organized mass marches and student walkouts, openly violating local ordinances they considered unjust to occupy public spaces and disrupt the local economy.
Right. It's almost like a form of political judo. You aren't attacking the opponent with violence. You are using the sheer weight and brutality of the opponent's own system against them on a public stage. You want the cameras to see the police dogs and the fire hoses.
And when King was thrown in jail in Birmingham, which, by the way, was his 13th arrest out of an eventual 29 times behind bars, he doesn't just wait for bail. He writes the famous letter from Birmingham Jail, scribbling it on the margins of smuggled newspapers.
That letter crystallizes his entire philosophical argument. He famously wrote that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed.
Yes.
He systematically dismantled the argument of moderate leaders who told him to wait for a more convenient season. He pointed out the chilling historical fact that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was technically legal, while the Boston Tea Party was illegal civil disobedience.
Legality does not equal morality.
Exactly. He utilized his own incarceration to force middle-class America to confront its own hypocrisy.
And he scales that strategy up to the national level later that same year with the March on Washington. But the sources reveal something that completely surprised me. President John F. Kennedy, who we often associate as a champion of civil rights, actually opposed the march initially.
The Kennedy administration was terrified. They were trying to get a civil rights bill through a highly divided Congress. Kennedy feared that a massive, uncontrollable protest in the nation's capital would result in violence, cause a massive political backlash, and completely ruin the chances of passing any legislation. He pressured King and the other leaders to call it off.
But they hold firm. They force the administration's hand, the march is peaceful, King delivers the I Have a Dream speech, and it creates the political momentum that ultimately leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Those two pieces of legislation fundamentally dismantled the legal framework of Jim Crow segregation in the United States.
So, what does this all mean? If we look at this through the lens of a typical historical narrative, this is where the movie ends, right? He wins the Super Bowl of civil rights legislation. The big laws are passed.
You'd think so, yeah.
But instead of retiring with the trophy and cementing his popularity, he immediately pivots. He decides to take on the entire military and economic establishment of the United States. It's a massive, highly unpopular expansion of his mission.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, King recognized that legal equality was effectively hollow without economic equity and global peace.
Right. What good does it do to win the legal right to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you literally cannot afford to buy a hamburger?
Exactly. He saw racism, poverty, and militarism as intertwined evils.
And the moment he expands his vision beyond Southern segregation, the weight of the entire federal state comes crashing down on him. The FBI surveillance detailed in these sources is chilling. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, viewed King not as a civil rights leader, but as a massive threat to national security.
Hoover authorized King to be targeted under COINTELPRO. For those unfamiliar, COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. It was a series of covert and often completely illegal projects conducted by the FBI aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic political organizations.
And we must frame this exactly as the historical sources present it. The FBI wiretapped his phones and bugged his hotel rooms. They aggressively investigated him for alleged communist ties, which King adamantly and repeatedly denied.
Right.
They actively spread damaging rumors about his private life to newspaper reporters, powerful politicians, and even to his own family members to destroy his reputation.
The psychological warfare reached a terrifying peak in 1964. Just days before King was scheduled to travel to Norway to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI mailed him an anonymous threatening package.
Oh, this part is just horrifying.
It contained an audio tape allegedly of King's private encounters, accompanied by a letter telling him his end was approaching. King and his advisors interpreted the letter as an explicit, government-sponsored attempt to blackmail him into committing suicide before he could accept the award.
Imagine you are trying to hold a fractured, exhausted movement together, and your own government is running a psychological operation to drive you to self-destruction. But despite that unimaginable pressure, he doesn't retreat. He pushes forward and publicly comes out against the Vietnam War.
Taking a stance against the Vietnam War was incredibly risky. And looking at the history impartially, we see the immediate fallout. By opposing the war, King directly alienated President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been his vital political ally for the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts.
The sources show it wasn't just politicians who turned on him. He lost the support of influential union leaders, powerful publishers, and even many of his closest civil rights allies.
Yeah, they believed he was diluting the movement by mixing civil rights with foreign policy.
Major publications just ripped him apart. Life magazine called his anti-war speech demagogic slander. And the Washington Post declared he had diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, his people.
He was completely ostracized by the mainstream establishment, but he went even further, pivoting hard toward economic justice. King became a fierce critic of the two dominant global systems.
Right.
He stated that capitalism had outlived its usefulness because it consistently failed to protect the masses from poverty. Simultaneously, he fiercely rejected communism, arguing it was politically totalitarian, denied basic human freedoms, and suppressed religion.
So he was essentially leaning toward democratic socialism. And just to be clear on the terminology here, he wasn't advocating for Soviet-style state control. He was arguing for a society where the economy is restructured to serve the people democratically. He believed that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism were deeply tied together. You couldn't uproot one without uprooting the others.
He explicitly called for a radical redistribution of economic and political power. He began planning what he called the Poor People's Campaign. The strategy was to bring thousands of impoverished Americans of all races to physically occupy Washington, D.C., setting up a massive camp to force the federal government to invest billions in rebuilding America's cities and eradicating poverty.
Taking on the local sheriffs in the Jim Crow South was incredibly dangerous. But taking on the entire military-industrial complex and the foundational economic system of the United States was a completely different level of warfare. It exhausted him physically and emotionally. It fractured his remaining alliances.
And ultimately, it placed him on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah.
In the spring of 1968, King traveled to Memphis not for a massive national march, but to support a local strike by black sanitation workers. They were protesting horrendous working conditions and deathly unequal pay. For King, this strike was the perfect, localized intersection of his fight for both racial dignity and economic justice.
And it was there, on April 4th, 1968, at 6:01 p.m., that he was assassinated by a sniper bullet.
The historical record shows that James Earl Ray was convicted of the assassination. It's important to note impartially that the assassination remains a subject of various conspiracy theories, including claims made much later by people like Lloyd Jowers and persistent allegations of broader government complicity.
Right, though it should be mentioned that multiple official U.S. Department of Justice investigations over the decades have consistently concluded there is no evidence of a wider conspiracy.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to the very beginning of our deep dive, the autopsy. The 39-year-old man whose chest held a 60-year-old heart. When you actually trace the trajectory from the traumatized boy jumping out of a window in immense grief, to the teenager fighting off an armed, racist cafe owner, to the man surviving stabbings, bombings, FBI blackmail campaigns, and the complete abandonment by his political allies, that rapid aging makes perfect, tragic sense.
2 months before he died, King delivered a sermon at his church where he openly reflected on his own mortality and how he wanted to be remembered. He explicitly instructed his congregation that he didn't want people to mention his Nobel Peace Prize or his hundreds of other accolades.
He said he just wanted to leave a committed life behind. He wanted to be remembered as a drum major for justice, a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness.
He recognized that the shallow, polished awards wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of history. He wanted his legacy to be defined by his uncompromising service to humanity, regardless of the personal cost.
And that leaves us with a profound realization. As a society, we love to freeze historical figures in their safest, most triumphant moments. We replay the I Have a Dream speech because the imagery is beautiful, unifying, and comfortable.
It's safe.
It is safe. But King's true, unvarnished legacy might actually be found in those final, exhausted years when he was deeply unpopular, challenging the very economic and military foundations of the country.
Confronting the unpolished stone forces us to look at the radical reality of his philosophy, rather than the sanitized version we read in textbooks.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We live in an era of algorithmic outrage, where our technology and social media platforms are specifically designed to polarize us, filter out nuance, and amplify anger.
Yeah, the internet loves a simple narrative.
It does. If Martin Luther King Jr. were organizing today, armed with those exact same complex demands, calling for radical, unconditional love while simultaneously demanding massive economic redistribution, how would the modern internet handle him? Would a message that challenges both the left and the right be able to cut through the noise, or would the algorithms simply filter him out before the movement could even begin?
It's a fascinating question about how modern tools might clash with his historical methods. Thank you for exploring the sources with us today.
We hope you join us for the next deep dive.